in the summer when there was a discussion on arms to Israel. I want to explore why the Ukraine carries the threat of a wider war across Europe and has nuclear potential. And I want to explain it in simple and practical terms, not because NATO is an aggressive military alliance, which it is, not because the United States is a belligerent imperialist power, which it is, and not because the inexperienced, conventional and uninspired British government is following along tamely after the United States. I want to take a practical look at the steps that have gone on, not just for the last 3 years, but for the last couple of decades. Okay, so first of all, CND thinks we're in a very dangerous situation. It includes the potential use of nuclear weapons, but we are definitely not saying, and we're very clear on this, that nuclear use is imminent. We're not suggesting that you should head for the hills or say your final goodbyes to friends and relatives when you leave the meeting tonight. But nuclear war is there, it's on the table, and as the situation in Ukraine escalates, so that potential grows. So, Ukraine, as our chair says, is something which Britain is directly involved in. We provide, we're the third largest donor after the United States and Germany. There was almost 2.5 billion more in the recent budget. We supplied Challenger 2 tanks, which have been used extensively by Ukraine. And recently, as everyone knows, we've given permission for the Storm Shadow missiles to be used against Russia. The second reason that Britain is directly involved and is one of the primary targets in an expanded war is because we've got nuclear weapons. Trident is capable of being deployed against Russia. The third reason is we're a member of the NATO military alliance with the first nuclear use policy, and membership of the alliance means that in the case of a conflict, our nuclear weapons are dedicated to NATO. We'll be asked to use them, or we may be asked to use them. And the fourth reason, which the British public is becoming a bit more aware of, is that Britain is one of 6 forward nuclear bases in Europe. That's along with Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Turkey. The 6th nuclear base. American nuclear weapons are coming to RAF Lakenheath. That's a euphemism. It's a USAF. It's an American Air Force run facility. And if you're not aware of it, it's only 125 miles from where we're sitting now. So all of us could be directly involved in any conflict. The F35 bombers are already there, pilots are being trained to use them. We don't know when the missiles will come, but we think that they are close. The current escalation began in August, when for the first time the United States gave Ukraine permission to use short-range weapons into Russian territory. And in response to that, Putin said at the beginning of September that any decision to use weapons in that way meant that, I'm going to quote this because it's very carefully and diplomatically phrased, He said, "It will mean nothing other than direct participation by NATO countries, the United States and European allies, in the war in Ukraine, and of course that changes the very essence of the conflict. It will mean that NATO countries are fighting with Russia." Now, he phrased it in a way that didn't declare war, but it's obvious that that is what he's suggesting and what he's pointing towards. And Russia subsequently amended its nuclear doctrine, its nuclear strategy, to incorporate that point. Now, we've heard a lot about that on the news and on social media, but what you've not been told is that the United States and Britain have already amended their nuclear strategies to take account of that. So, America changed its policy in 2018, that was during the first Trump presidency, and the US nuclear posture review of that year was widened to include, quote, significant non-nuclear strategic attacks. In other words, America is prepared to use its nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapons possessing states. Britain followed suit in 2018, and notes that that came under the Trump presidency. There's much talk about him doing a deal, and maybe he will, but we shouldn't assume that that will be a deal that is favourable to us or to Russia or to the people of Ukraine. We know that the war has a dual character. It's not only a conflict over territorial boundaries, it's a proxy war between two nuclear powers, between US and NATO on the one side and Russia on the other. But the war propaganda that is churned out by Britain absolutely daily obfuscates, covers all these aspects of things. We're simply told that Putin is an evil man and Russia is rampant, it wants to recreate a sort of greater Soviet Russia across Europe. There's not much evidence for that. And there certainly isn't any evidence at all that Russia is capable of doing such a thing. So I just want, for a moment or two, to look at what Russia's strategic interests are. Not to defend Putin, not to support him, not to attack Zelensky, but simply because you can't understand how to end a conflict if you don't understand what the interests of both parties are. So, Russia's got three war aims. I'll say it in a sentence. Maybe Andrew will go into this in more detail when he speaks, I don't know. It wants to prevent encirclement by by NATO. It wants to defend the culturally Russian minorities, mostly in the west and the south, but not entirely. And it wants to have access to the world's seas and oceans, which it believes that the United States is threatening. And think of a map of Russia. You've probably seen many over recent months. Russia is almost entirely landlocked. It wants access, not simply for security reasons, but also for reasons of trade. The expansion of Europe and the encirclement of Russia is a fact. It began to be planned by the United States when the USSR formally dissolved at the end of 1991, and the first Eastern Bloc countries were admitted to NATO membership in 1997, and that's been growing ever since. And you can look at a map of that on the NATO website, and you can see the reality with your own eyes. And what the United States and NATO have done since then is to build a series of bases across Europe, not only to take on Russia, but also think of some of the other conflicts, the growing Cold War on China and so on. In order to do what they're doing, again, the United States unilaterally announced at the beginning of 2001, I think it was, maybe 2002, the United States unilaterally announced it was going to withdraw from the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the Intermediate Ballistic Missile Treaty. And that was something which had kept the peace for many, many years. It ensured that Russia and the Soviet Union and the United States had an approximately balanced nuclear arsenal, and the argument went that if each were capable of knocking out the other side with nuclear weapons, it was a deterrent against war. That was not CND's position, that was a conventional argument. Okay, I'm going to have to speak even faster. The final thing I wanted to do is to give you an example of, some of you may know this, but most of you will not, to give you an example of what the United States and NATO is actually building across Europe today. There are many things, but I'll just stick to one. And that is something called the Aegis Ashore Ballistic Missile Defence System. On the same day that Russia launched that new missile of it has against Dnipro in Ukraine, the NATO authority was holding a formal ceremony in the north of Poland to welcome the opening of this new ballistic missile defence. Maybe it had something to do with it, maybe not, who knows. And the Aegis Ashore system is linked in the following way. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Israeli defences by now, the Iron Dome, think Iron Dome, on a much bigger and more sophisticated scale. So this system, this ballistic missile defence system, is linked to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which is the headquarters of the NATO's BDM command, Ballistic Missile Defence Command. There is an early warning system in Turkey. There's an Aegis interceptor base in Romania, and the base I mentioned in Poland is the second one of that type that has just become operational, just been opened. And the final sort of link in that chain is US destroyers based in Spain which are capable of taking out the missiles when they're detected. Okay, just a sentence to finish if I may. This is what Keir Starmer's triple lock on Trident means. It's bad news. There is nothing good about having a triple lock on a nuclear weapon system. And we have to find a way of getting our governments and the governments of Europe to step back from the nuclear brink. Labour's manifesto said, and Starmer continues to repeat, the first duty of any government is to defend Britain from attack. We say the first duty of the British government is to defend Britain against a nuclear weapons attack. And that means de-escalating, calling for a ceasefire, opening negotiations to end the Ukraine war. It's not going to be easy, and as I said earlier, it might be something which will be started by Trump, but that's not necessarily positive easy. The only way that the peace and anti-war movement and the labour movement can begin to exercise this sort of influence is by taking to the streets in the way that we've seen people do for over 12 months for Gaza. And your meeting is one of the first small steps that are being taken towards that tonight. So thank you very much for inviting CND. Sorry, I'm